Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me as the Dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy of the O.P. Jindal Global University to invite all of you, all the participants, to a very special occasion when we wish to celebrate a very interesting book written by our colleague, Dr. Arup Chatterjee, called Indians in London, From the Birth of the East India Company to Independent India, published by Bloomsbury. It's not often that we have, well-researched books by faculty. Not every day, I mean, but we do have quite a few in this university, and that's one of the things we are proud about. So I'm very pleased to welcome a very distinguished group of people to talk about the book and to listen to the author after our guests have made their comments. So I'm grateful that the Vice Chancellor found the time to be here with us to start off the proceedings after my welcome. I especially invite and welcome Professor Gopalkrishna Gandhi, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, my good friend from Oxford days, Paul Flather, and Professor Michael Fisher, who's in the United States, and rather early for him at this hour. I got, except to say that, I haven't, as some of us must honestly admit, read the book from cover to cover, but it begins with, on a very appetizing note about restaurants in London and when they began, and some anecdotes which I didn't know. I used to be a favorite customer at Veerasami's, and I was one of those people who believed it was named after some South Indian gentleman, me being a Ramaswamy. But now I learned that that's all untrue, and the real story is somewhat different. The book begins on that very appetizing note, and incidentally ends on that as well, with references to restaurants in London now, and he's written a wonderful book on the railways. So he has a quote from Kipling about two little-known railway stations in central India, where Kipling says everything begins, and Arup nicely winds up his book with a reference to Dickens and London and India kissing. So that's all I have to say about the book. So now I hand it over to the Vice Chancellor to celebrate our colleague and proceed with the book launch.
Thank you very much, Dean Sudarshan. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this very, very special book launch of the book Indians in London, written by a very dear colleague of ours, Professor Arup Chatterjee. I want to also take this moment to extend a warm welcome to a number of good friends and people who have supported our university since its inception, and also people who have done significant work in this field. Professor Dr. Paul Flather, Professor Gopalkrishna Gandhi, Professor Dr. Michael Fisher, and of course, our own very dear Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I'm also particularly grateful to each one of them for taking time out of their very busy schedule to be with us. The organizers of this book launch have been very generous to give me 15 minutes to talk about whatever I wanted to say. I want to give that most of the time to our distinguished panelists here. So I'll take just 3 to 4 minutes to really celebrate this occasion. For those of you who may or may not be familiar with the university itself, I want to say that O.P. Jindal Global University was founded in the year 2009 through the benefactor and our founding chancellor, Mr. Naveen Jindal. The vision from the day one was to build a truly world-class university in India with a strong focus on research, knowledge creation, publications, and to build an intellectually vibrant ecosystem with a view to advancing the cause of higher education with special reference to the broader ambit of liberal arts, humanities, and social sciences. We continue to remain a non-STEM, non-medicine university one of those rare creatures still in India. The university was founded with barely 100 students and 10 full-time faculty members in the year 2009. Precisely on 30th September 2009, we had just one school, the Jindal Global Law School. And today we are going to be celebrating our 12th anniversary in the next 10 days. And we have grown significantly into 12 different schools in law, business, international affairs, public policy, liberal arts, journalism, architecture, banking and finance, environment and sustainability, psychology and counseling, and the two new schools that we have just set up, the Jindal School of Languages and Literature and the Jindal School of Public Health and Human Development, both of which will begin its academic session in August 2022. Our student numbers have increased significantly. We have moved from 100 students in 2009 to little over 8,000 students. Our faculty members have also grown significantly, with just 10 faculty members in 2009 to nearly 1,000 faculty members full-time who are working at JGU. Along this journey, there are numerous people who have helped us, supported us, inspired us, and continue to be ambassadors of our journey and our effort. And one such person is Dr. Shashi Tharoor. And I am grateful to him for inspiring me from my early days as a student at Harvard when I met him in the year 1999. And since then, he has spoken at least 20 times for events at OP Jindal Global University and has never charged a single pie for doing that. So I'm grateful to him for his generosity, his magnanimity, and his constant inspiration that he has showered upon us, and also a generation of students and faculty members. I also want to mention that one of the things that we are conscious of at our university is our strong commitment to creating a culture of research. Professor Arup Chatterjee epitomizes that culture of research. In a relatively very short span of time, he has produced significant work, including research articles, publications as book chapters, and of course, books, edited journals, even founded journals, all of which he has done in a very short span of time. He joins the other 900 plus faculty members who have produced nearly 100 books since the inception of the university, along with over 3,000 publications, which has made Jindal Global University a truly intellectual hub. And I'm grateful to him for that. Lastly, I want to say that this book itself is a fascinating work that he has done. I have not read it, but I know I've had opportunities to discuss with Arup about the vision of his own scholarship. And I know for sure that it's going to be a fascinating book, and also to be well received by people from all walks of life. The launch function itself epitomizes that diversity. We have amazing individuals, 4 of whom have contributed in different ways towards scholarship, towards public life, towards institution building, and towards research. And I'm very, very grateful to each one of them for joining us on this occasion. So I would like to end by saying congratulations, Arup, for your fantastic work. You will be inspiring a number of our young faculty members in particular to contribute to research along with their other responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also must mention that we have Professor Sridhar Patnaik, the registrar, and in so many ways when we organize anything in the university, we are indebted to the staff of the registrar's office to make things happen, the real engine room of the university. So thank you, Sridhar, for joining us on this occasion. So I think I'll now hand over to Albeena Shakil to invite our guests in whatever order she likes, and beginning with some remarks that she would like to make about the book. And then after the guests have spoken, we would want Arup as the author to react to some of the comments that he would hear, and then we'll close with that. So over to you, Albeena.
Yes, thank you, Professor Sudarshan, and thank you, Professor Raj Kumar. today is a very, very good occasion for me because I co-teach undergraduate students with Arup, and we teach students together, and students have derive a lot of pleasure from the wealth of knowledge that Arup brings to the classrooms. Now, for today's book discussion, we have four eminent scholars who really need no introduction, and yet I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly. What we will do is that each scholar, each distinguished scholar will get about 10 minutes to speak on Arup's book, and then Arup will, for another 10 minutes, have a response, talk about his own book, and also have a response to the comments that are made. Now, I'm really looking forward to listening to what Professor Gopalkrishna Gandhi, Professor Paul Flather, Professor Michael Fisher, and Dr. Shashi Tharoor have to say. But let me start off by just some few opening comments, because Arup gave me a preview of the book. So I have the preview of the book, and it is fascinating because it traces almost 5 centuries of Indian immigration and Indian settlement into London. So, of course, displaces the common sense that the story of London and India is only a story of colonialism. So displaces that fundamental common sense, takes it to pre-colonial times, takes it to times when the gaze from both sides was perhaps not through the hierarchy that colonialism brought. So there is an interesting gaze, an interesting assessment of both sides from a perhaps more equitable position, and a more peer level gaze, rather than looking upwards or looking westwards or looking eastwards, because colonialism also turned the West into more of a West and the East into more of an East. So Arup takes it back and starts the story from there. And what is so interesting is that there are, from women to men to ayahs to, big prince and princesses and kings and queens to people pursuing education, different castes, different classes, different regions of India, and different periods. And what is so fascinating, at least at the opening preview that I had, was that Arup seamlessly moves from past to present, to here and there, and it's a reader who Arup doesn't allow the reader to sort of sit back and relax. Rather, he sort of challenges the reader to jig their memory, to remember things, to make connections, to be more active and participant readers as well. So I'm really looking forward to what our panelists have to say today. We have today, first of all, Professor Gopalkrishna Gandhi. He is, our audience would know very well, he's former High Commissioner and Ambassador. He is a director of the Nehru Center, London, and has been the former governor of West Bengal. So it's a pleasure to have you here. It's an honor to have you here, Professor Gandhi. For the opening comments, over to you for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Albeena. May I request you to just interrupt me when I reach the 9th minute to tell me that I have just 1 minute more on an absolutely fascinating book. It is a book which I could not help read as soon as I unpacked it, and I just read it in one go, almost in one go. And this is for a few reasons, and I will explain them in 5 quick points. The most engaging thing about the book is, of course, its writing style. It has been written with a kind of immediacy. It's almost there's a breathlessness to the way in which it has been written. It's almost as if Arup Babu is rushing to get into the last underground connection from Piccadilly to something else in London, and he's going to miss the train. So he wants to complete the story very, very fast. There's a breathlessness, and it's very infectious breathlessness, because if it's written with speed, it is also read with speed. And then it is an extraordinary experience to read something in speed, in sync with the speed with which it is written. So it was that. Then I saw that there was the complete and most refreshing absence of what may be called a predetermined agenda. It has not been written to prove anything or disprove anything. He has not set out to say, oh my God, Indians have been a tremendous influence in Britain. Immigration by Indians to England has been a great gift from India to England. He has written the book without any such agenda. And it's a book that's been written out of sheer interest in the subject of Indians in London. And it has a clear focus. And by clear focus, I mean clear focus. He has not written about Indians as part of Asia who are in England, which is part of Europe. No, it's very clear. Indians in London, not even Indians in Birmingham or Manchester, but Indians in London. Clear, sharp. And then no slant, as Albeena, if I might call you Albeena, if Albeena herself has said that there is no slant in it. It has the subaltern, to use a current phrase. It has got royalty. It has rich people and absolute down and outers. But he has not taken it as an opportunity to speak for one or the other community or class or slice of humanity. It is Indians, and Indians in all their variety, in all their contrasts, in all their contradictions, conflicted as they are, but Indians. Finally, I would say something which I would not have expected at first reading. As I said, the book has been written with a stopwatch. He doesn't want to miss a second. It has been written with immediacy. He has used available, sometimes primary records, sometimes secondary records, original work, but direct work with immediacy, but without a voyeuristic intimacy. He has not tried to say something which has not been said before in some sensational way. No. He has tried to unravel stories without making them sensational. There is a kind of sympathy and respect for the persons being talked about, even when he is being extremely critical, sometimes lethally critical of the persons. So these are the reasons why I enjoyed the book. If I still have a couple of minutes left, I think I would like to. How many minutes do I have, Albeena?
You have 7 more minutes.
Oh, that's a huge amount of time, but I won't take one. I must say some things about the book which don't make me partisan of the book. That give me also the kind of objectivity which Arup Babu has. So I must say something. This is not a review of the book. This is a launch of the book. But I can be allowed the latitude and the privilege of saying things about the book which are not entirely laudatory or capriciative. I would say I was so glad to see that the book has photographic plates, but the photographs selected being amazingly good as they are, the reproduction is amazingly problematic. The titles and the pictures don't gel, and I strained every little edge of the plate to see if there was some description of the photograph, some description of the photographer, but no. And then I looked at the end to see if there were some back references to the plates. No. So in the next edition, Arup Babu will, I'm sure, see that the photographs, the illustrations are allowed to tell their story without tantalizing and disappointing the reader. But that is a matter of production. There is something else which I must say I found problematic in the book, and that was the overpowering of the broader picture by the individual sharpness of persons, which is all right. If in a book which says Indians in London, you are talking about individuals, but there, and I said there is no predetermined agenda. which is a very good thing. But there is something like a theme towards which the book is traveling, not predetermined, not preconditioned, but something like a consensus of or a convergence of ideas that somehow eluded me. I don't want at the end of the book there to be a synopsis or a conclusion saying QED, this is what the book is about. No, but when you finish a book, you want to carry not just a huge collection of fascinating stories, but something which coheres into an overarching view. I missed that, but it could be that I have missed it, others may not miss it. I want to now talk about some outstanding features of the book. I spoke of what I liked about the book, what I found problematic about the book, and now what I find absolutely outstanding about the book. And that is the description of a few persons who are little known, less understood, but hugely important. Among them, the most, I thought, almost heroically present in the book was the communist leader Saklatwala. Now, Nauroji is the grand old man not only of India, but he's the grand old man of the history of India and Britain, for being the first, as they said, man of color to be in the House of Commons, winning by 3 votes, so much so that Nauroji, because he won by 3 votes, was called narrow majority. And this is something which makes Nauroji so completely unique. But with Nauroji there, for another Parsi who got into parliament, Saklatwala, to loom over Nauroji is an achievement of achievements. And it's entirely deserved because Saklatwala is so important. So I think that was something which completely amazed me. And there's a presence of an Indian in England, in London, which is not of an Indian, but of an Indian individual, but of an Indian entity, and which is the Kohinoor. I think the Kohinoor shines and glitters in the book, but doesn't glitter in some kind of a tinselly or a tawdry way, but glitters with history, completely held tight in its veins. And I must say, this is an achievement of the book. An insentient Indian, the Kohinoor. And in London today, and perhaps in London for the foreseeable future. There is an Indian who is not an Indian, but who is an Indian nonetheless, and that is the Indian who's become the Indian civil servant of British origin, or the Indian Viceroy or Governor General of British origin. Dalhousie is a conflicted and controversial figure, but Dalhousie was more Indian, I think, than many other viceroys. Sorry, he was not viceroy, he was Governor General. And Dalhousie's fleeting presence in the book captures one's imagination, but wants to know more about it. So I hope in the next edition, this outstanding figure who was responsible for the Kohinoor's journey from India to Dalhousie, with others of Dalhousie's kind, like Curzon and like Mending, figure a little more prominently. I'll now end by saying the other person who just drenches me with his unique presence in the book is the great Raja Ram Mohan Roy, whose work in India continues to be done every time an advance is made towards gender justice. Ram Mohan Roy speaks again. And Ram Mohan Roy's work in Britain, through London and Brighton, Bristol, emerges very, very sharply. So this is a book which is a book of multiple dimensions. It is also a biography of many biographies and of many stories. Arup Babu has us in his debt. Arup Babu is to be complimented, and he is to be requested to repeat his performance in subsequent editions of the book, which will be as fascinating as this particular volume has already proved to be. Congratulations, Arup Babu. Congratulations to the publishers, and congratulations to the university, so ably led by Vice Chancellor Raj Kumar. And thank you, Sudarshan, for asking me to join this discussion. Meeting you virtually has been one of the great bonuses of this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Gandhi, for your very, very kind, very generous words for the university, for the team. I'm sure that Professor Arup would be thinking about everything that you have said, which are such perceptive and insightful comments. So thank you for those, Professor Gandhi. Without further ado, I would now move to our second speaker for the day, Professor Paul Flather. Professor Paul, we are lucky to have him as a visiting professor at OP Jindal Global University right now, but he's a fellow at Mansfield College, Oxford. So it's an honor and pleasure to have you here, Professor Flather, and over to you for your comments on the book.
Well, thank you very much. And I was thrilled to hear your remarks, Gopalkrishna, if I can call you that. And thank you, Jindal, for organizing this wonderful event. And thank you, Arup, for this wonderful book, as you'll discover in my remarks. I think I want to make 3 or 4 main points. And I'll try and go to reaching out to some kind of overarching points, which might provoke. But let me start with some general thoughts. First of all, it's just quite a remarkable achievement, as has been said. I mean, this is 500 pages packed with gems, with remarkable memories, wonderful vignettes, terrific anecdotes, and drawn so widely, both historically and in terms of the themes. I think we all know that the first main settlement in London was 43 AD, some 2,000 years ago, although I think they're still digging up artifacts which show that original bridges were being built in London 2,000 or 3,000 years before that. And of course, since the Romans, we've had the Vikings, the Saxons, the Danes, then came the Normans, the Jews, the Dutch, the Huguenots, the Irish. The city always remained one of the sort of foremost centers in Europe. And into this mix, as Arup Chatterjee has charted so well, came the first Indians. Initially a rather small trickle, galvanized through the spice trade and the East India Company and later the British Raj. It becomes, if you like, a brook and then a stream, and then we could say a veritable tributary. And we come back to that water metaphor later, as Arup does in his book. It's really a huge piece of work. Indeed, when it thudded down on my mat, I was saying, when it came through the post, I was rather nervous, you know, whether I could manage it, whether I would enjoy it, and whether I could actually complete it in decent order in time for this event. But I think, as has been remarked, it was such a wonderful read, and particularly I thought the first chapter. I thought the first chapter was, you know, it was a shape-shifting chapter. It was a literary chapter that took you all over the place through literature, through history, through personal memoir. I mean, it was that was a really amazing thing. And of course, it's very timely, given the prominence of Indians now in British society today, heading companies, professions, social life, and politics. Of course, we've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer, we've got the Home Secretary, and the Mayor of London and the Health Secretary are from Pakistan, so you might call that Greater India, and arguably now playing their rightful place in making what the Prime Minister wants to make Britain into a new kind of global Britain. So what are my points? The first point I want to talk about is relationships. So this is a book about a relationship, or more accurately, 3 relationships. So I found that it traced the roles and influence of London on Indians. And it's very comfortable and explanatory in doing that. And the author draws on these copious parish records, bills, paintings, all kinds of archaeological and archival material, a magnificent effort. And we get this story of the Lascars, the Ayers, the merchants, the diplomats, the soldiers. And of course, you're drawn to particular stories. I was very drawn to Princess Sophia I'd never heard of. And there are so many, Suleiman Nur, Samuel Munzer. The early stories I thought really I knew absolutely nothing about. some of the 19th century and 20th century figures, of course, one is a bit familiar with, but Julian, Catherine Bengal, and Peter Pope, and I want to come back to Peter Pope at the end. And we discover that by the 19th century, the proportion of Indians living in Britain is larger than a proportion of the British living in India. I found that a very telling point. And I like the idea, of course, that he shows how the Indians in London fraternize with the Brits, and perhaps even more freely than Indians can fraternize with the colonialists in India, and you know, exchange ideas and meet in all kinds of places. And of course, once the demands of trade and empire and so on grow, then more and more Indians come to Britain. I'm particularly interested in students working in the in universities and so on, and remember the early civil servants that are sent here to study, and then more and more students come. And in Oxford, Benjamin Jowett, who was the head of the college that Sudarshan and I went to, was, I think, the first to bring civil servants over. And this flow has been incredibly significant. So that by the 1930s, the highest proportion of overseas students were from India. I think now it's probably competing with China, but it's a very significant and important story. And of course, since the war, the story has gone on. This is beyond the book, with nurses and teachers and doctors invited to help rebuild Britain after the ravages of war. I think today, we think 6.6% of Indians, according to the official National Statistics Office, are Indians. And you can add another 800,000 Indians with Indian passports, if you like, who live in Britain. So it's a very critical and important number. So that's the first relationship, but then it's the second part of this relationship, which is the influence that Indians have had on London. And I found the book hugely illuminating on this, and the sheer range of themes, the arts, religion, and of course cuisine, which has been mentioned, the famous Veerasamis, where I've also been, and I went there when the famous red flocked wallpaper was still the order of the day. In fact, any self-serving posh Indian restaurant had to have that as its decor. I think it's going through yet another makeover to try and get back. It's not regarded as well as it used to be, but it still has kind of ambitions. Then the politics, of course, is very crucial to the story, very interesting for me. The influence of spirituality also. And I mean, the stories of the Indian League battling against fascism, and the Indian, just getting into a muddle here, the Indian House promoting rights and equality. And of course, is one when it's drawn to these amazing stories of Dadabhai Naoroji, as mentioned, Baron Sinha, and the wonderful Sarojini Naidu, and of course, Saklit Bala. And I want to come back to those in a moment. So the influence of London, of course, is very, very significant on me as well. I mean, I've spent 25 years living in London. And I was actually reading this book in a cafe in Oxford when an old friend, Peter Oppenheimer, the economist, walked by and stopped to chat and look at the book. And he recalled that his father had been drawn to London when he escaped the Hitler persecutions in the 1930s in Germany. And one of the reasons he said that his father so enjoyed London was its cosmopolitanism. And he particularly recalled the contribution of Indians, which he said had made the city so fascinating for him. So that was quite a touching moment. I mean, I myself arrived in, and forgive me for peppering this with a few remarks, but as I say, I do see myself as an Indian in London, and a Londoner who's been influenced with the Indian heritage. So I arrived in India age 7. It was the coldest of winters. I remember playing in t-shirt and bare feet in the snow because I hadn't any appreciation that it was cold. It was just fun. And we stayed in a flat in Earl's Court, which is still a landing strip for many migrant communities. And and since then, if you like, my mother has now become the first Indian woman in the Parliament, in the House of Lords. My brother is a cardiovascular professor, and I've been involved in media, politics, and academia. So in a sense, this circularity of influence, I hope that we're now contributing to Britain, but also with our Indian heritage. But there is a third relationship implicit here, and that is the influence that the returning Indians have on India, what Christopher Bailey in his seminal work would call the circulation of ideas. And I thought that Gopalkrishna might discuss this, particularly with relation to what Arup so cleverly calls the Indian baristocracy. And maybe Shashi will talk about this, because I don't, this will have to be for another place. So I want to make two other general remarks. I think I still have time. One is about the concept of otherness. So what struck me underlying this wonderful potpourri was that it was also a sort of riff over history about otherness, and told in a very gentle, accessible way, as Albeena has kind of indicated. I mean, we start with this reference to the Indian Caliban, who makes an appearance in Shakespeare. And we look through dress, and we look through religion, and we look through codes, and we look through the ubiquitous curry. The word curry we now know to be quite an unfortunate term, but we're stuck with it because it's so generalized. And it's all, you could say it's all helpful grist to the mill of what Edward Said went on to call the notion of Orientalism, but that is a bit challenged. But it does illuminate, I think, ideas of how the East came to London, and of course the kind of slightly romantic views that developed, and this idea of otherness is so significant. We watch it turn and churn as the age of enlightenment and liberalism, and perhaps Hobsbawm's age of revolutions, emerged in the 19th century. And although struggles continue and clashes continue, not least epitomized by the famous clash between Gandhi and Churchill over the Round Table period, but we also see a beginning of an understanding, a sense of tolerance, a sense of reaching out from the British community. So I think understanding and recognizing otherness is not only essential to this new global world we live in, but it can be so positive and so beneficial. And I really appreciated the book for actually tracking and tracing that through in a way that I haven't really seen anywhere else. In other writings, it's over crystallized and to borrow from Gopal Grandi, sort of over opinionated. And here you could take from the potpourri your own interpretations and mix from all the individual stories, and I really appreciated that. And my final point, I think, is just to is to talk a little bit about global tapestry. You know, globalization, Anthony Giddens once said, well, he tried to define it once. He came up with 57 different varieties. But I think my point is going to be simple, because I think that globalization there may have been attempts to define it in an LSE seminar room 30, 40 years ago, but really it's been with us all the time. And this book shows us that it has been, and we have to really rip apart the kind of current notions and see it as something that's just been part of the world. I mean, driven essentially, as Arup points out, by the spice trend. And I confess here that I really can never eat any meal whatsoever without pepper. That'll be my last thing when I have to give up all my goods, will be my pepper mill. So the traders have moved around the world, and in the wake of the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch came the British, and so was born this intricate relationship between these two countries, these two civilizations. Now there is an underlying narrative, of course, one of colonial exploitation and racism, but I think what this book does is it doesn't over-focus on that, but adds texture and understanding to it, and unravels the complexities and strands that are involved in this relationship, particularly through the intimate descriptions of the individuals that lie below. And if Shashi will allow me to say this, I think that this is also an insight into this long drawn out revolution for freedoms. It was one, of course, with many casualties. And, you know, we can focus on Jallianwala Bagh and partition, but it was also one without a terror. And the kind of terror that characterized other revolutions launched by the likes of Robespierre or Lenin or Mao, and even of the wars and terrors that took part in the other comparable end of empire moments and movements involving Spain, France, and Portugal. And as part of understanding why that happened, I think this book contributes through explaining the kind of interwoven threads through individuals, through societies, through parties like Congress and so on, the creation of which. And I think that this is a significant contribution. I wanted to go back to particularly Sarojini Naidu. I mean, I found that section incredibly evocative. Obviously, I knew of her, but I had no real idea of what was achieved and done in London. And there's a wonderful passage. I don't know if I've got, how am I doing on time?
You are well into 16 minutes.
Okay, so I'm stopping now.
Sorry.
It's a wonderful bit about her. And it reminded me of the book by my friend Richard Simons, which talked about Oxford and Empire and how so much contribution was made by scholars to what became the Indian Renaissance. I'm going to end, so thank you, Arup, for this delightful historical and literary journey, meandering gently down the Thames and bringing us back to the Ganga, illuminating us so that we can clearly see the waters of both and see how they can mix and mingle. And on a personal note, I was just so touched by the story of Peter Pope. I too went to Britain with an anglicized name. I too went to a Church of England school that I'd been brought up partly as a Hindu. I too was baptized, and I too had to kind of rediscover my Indian heritage. And so that was a wonderful story. But let's enjoy this intermingling of the waters. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Flather, for all your comments, and particularly the fact that I was actually expecting Professor Gandhi to invoke something personal while talking, you know, in terms of personal history, in terms of history of families, in terms of, you know, so I was actually expecting Professor Gandhi to do that. But Professor Gandhi took another route. And another strength of Arup's book was brought out by your comments, where you sort of showed that it is so evocative, and Arup does go off the main street into the by lanes and alleyways of London and history as well, to sort of bring many other things which are so evocative onto the table. So thank you for your comments. And I will now go to our next speaker for the day, Professor Michael Fisher. Professor Michael Fisher is the Robert S. Danforth Professor of History. He's Emerita, Oberlin College, Ohio, USA. Welcome, and it's an honor to have you here, Professor Fisher. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's an honor to me to be invited to this exciting launch of such a scintillating book. And really echoing Dr. Shakil's remarks, I think among the volume's many valuable accomplishments stands its success in drawing attention to the centuries-long linkages between India and Britain that were accomplished not by the much written about Britons, but rather by diverse Indians of all classes. Professor Chatterjee shows through his study how these Indians lived in Britain, actually lived there. They were not merely acted upon by Britons, but rather they have their own agency, their own attitudes and their own actions. And Professor Chatterjee has really thus extended Indian history to include not just Britons, but extended Indian history to include all of Britain and adding really to the works that provincialize Europe in the spirit of Dipesh Chakravarti. Or if I can rephrase, these are really Indian counterflows to British colonialism, much less studied, but nonetheless quite important. I'd like to highlight briefly three key issues. First, Professor Chatterjee revealingly states that he, quote, writes from a fragile cusp between history and literature. And if he has time, perhaps he could explore how this gives him a more creative approach that empowers him to synthesize a broad range of topics and sources. And perhaps for comparison, we can turn to Dr. Tharoor, who has in fact written about history and literature from a very different perspective, the way that you can reveal history through literature. And really, Professor Chatterjee is revealing through the use of literature what I see as more historical kinds of events. Another unique feature that I don't think we have addressed yet is the adaptation of the structure of a Shakespearean play, which I saw was very creative, using 5 acts and 22 scenes to dramatize the narrative. And perhaps this is where literature comes in, because it's not a pure chronological, what we might consider historical sequence of events, but rather it flows back and forth as perhaps with references as a play might. And then turning to Dr. Gopal Gandhi's comments about there being no predetermined agenda, I'm not sure I'm convinced by that. In fact, Professor Chatterjee himself modestly, and I think really over modestly, claims that he has been indoctrinated, quote, in the comfortable ideology of not having one. Now, I'm not sure if anyone can write without an ideology of some sort. It may be hidden, it may be well disguised, but I think it really is there. And to me, Professor Chatterjee really skillfully uses what he says, quote, is colonialism as a multi-pronged tool. It emphatically supersedes binaries between subjugation and liberation. And I think this is, again, one of the key elements in the book. It shows Indians not as purely acted upon as the colonized and Europeans as all the dominating colonizer, but really it's a much more subtle interaction back and forth between these various people. And certainly Indians of different classes had different experiences in Britain. They interacted with different Britons, and many of them came back to India, even if they didn't formally write about their experiences there, with oral histories. And really, I think Indian culture was enriched in many ways by the impressions that these diverse Indians had when they returned to India after having lived in London over time. Thus, I think we should really recognize the deep thought and even the powerful ideology that Professor Chatterjee deploys throughout this really fine volume. And I'll just stop there, perhaps giving him a little more time to respond.
Thank you, Professor Fisher, for those very brief but very, very sharp and succinct comments on Arup's book, linking history and literature. I would say that I would also say that Arup's book is not just a Shakespearean play, but also almost like a non-fiction novel. It sort of reads like a story when one reads it, and yet there is a wealth of knowledge going on. So we have almost a panel discussion emerging out of these comments, because we have Professor Gandhi, who said that, what is the central thematics has to be discerned from the book. There is a lot there, but that thematics needs to be pushed. We have Professor Flather, who found the personally evocative, historically evocative part of the book sort of the most interesting. We have Professor Fisher, saying that Arup has an ideology, and it's a very compelling and powerful ideology in terms of how he is framing India and what he's framing to study, not just colonial times but pre-colonial times. So we have a diversity of views coming in already, and without further ado, without taking any more time, let me now invite Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a member of Parliament, a former United Nations Under Secretary General, and really an author of so many books that so many people love to read. So welcome, Dr. Tharoor, and over to you for your comments now.
Thank you very much. I think I can be brief because I must say I'm very pleased to join everyone in my appreciation of this marvelous book, which I'm going to show again for those who are tuning in on YouTube. It really is a delightful work which covers a vast amount of ground in its 500 pages. Full of detailed research, which nonetheless wears its erudition quite lightly. As others have said, starting with Gopalkrishna Gandhi, it really is amazingly readable with lots of anecdotes and stories, and a lot of nuggets that were discoveries for me. I mean, I had no idea that Veeraswamy was not a South Indian maker of doshas or whatever, but was named by its English founder, Edward Palmer, for his mother, Vera, and was supposed to be a play on Vera Saw Me, which to me is an astonishing discovery. It may partially explain why when I first went there in the 1970s, I found the food completely unedible and totally inauthentic, but that explains it. But there you are. I know it's been reformed since under Indian ownership. But I must confess I had a particular interest in the book because of my own family history. My father went to England and to London in particular as a student back in 1948 after the war, and his experience as a very ordinary young man. I mean, talking, for example, and this is not in the book, of the rationing that affected Indians terribly after the Second World War. He recounts having to queue up for literally everything. You had to fill in forms and get ration cards to entitle you to buy everything from newspapers to boots to bread. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I ended up with the name I have, because my father had dropped his caste surname for nationalist reasons because of Gopal Gandhi's grandfather's opposition to celebrating caste. And as a result, he and his younger brothers all had their Malayali Vitupera, the house family name first, then their given name, and they dropped their caste name, so they had no surname. And my father recounts stories of lining up for 2 hours in a queue with his blessed ration forms and being rejected at the counter because the 3 brothers were all on the same form. And they say only one family per form. And he said, we are a family, we are 3 brothers. And she says, do you have different fathers? You seem to have different surnames. So finally, he went off and reversed his name at a notary public and became Chandran Tharoor, which was extremely unusual in Kerala terms. When he married my mother, she became Mrs. Tharoor, which is even more of an unusual thing because in Kerala, that's not the way it works. And so I ended up with my father's family name, which in my Nair community is an absolute sacrilege. I should have been bearing my mother's family name as my first initial. So London actually affected my very identity in the name by which I'm known. Dad, in his early days as a very energetic student, befriended Krishna Menon at the India League and was one of those who did all the legwork for the founding of the India Club in 1951. And today there's a photograph and a plaque to him at the India Club, which has fallen on slightly harder times, and I gather is still battling for its own survival as developers want to tear it down. But what struck me from Arup's book, Arup Chatterjee's book, is the discovery that there actually was an earlier India Club in the late 18th century, and that Abdul Talib, who came from India in the 1790s, would frequent an India Club that had been set up for Englishmen who had returned from service in India. So it's quite astonishing. I mean, there's nothing really new under the sun, as they say. So anyway, all these anecdotes, all these discoveries are absolutely fascinating. And interestingly enough, because it is published by Bloomsbury Academic and is a work of a scholar and the professor, there are these fascinating occasional excursions into theory. So you'll find a delightful anecdote suddenly followed by quotations from Homi Bhabha's Location of Culture, which I actually found fascinating because, as I said, he has put it in a very readable way. It's not surprising in some ways that the book almost begins with a longish discussion of Indian food, because so many people associate, so many people in Britain associate India with food and restaurants, as I've had occasion to observe in the past. The so-called Indian curry houses actually employ more people in Britain today than the coal mining, iron and steel, and shipbuilding industries combined. So the empire has struck back. But what's interesting about these whole curry house stories is the way in which Arup Chatterjee, through telling the story of Indian cuisine in London, actually explains a whole lot of things. And in effect, there's a line where he quotes someone as saying, well, the Indians actually colonized London. And I think that probably is certainly not too far wrong. Certainly the poor British, having been deprived by God and nature of anything resembling a decent cuisine, were able to steal one by their Indian colonization experiment. And I think that the stories that Arup Chatterjee tells from their very first chapter on help explain why in the 1990s, Robin Cook, then as Foreign Secretary, when asked by an interviewer what was Britain's national dish, was able unabashedly to reply, chicken tikka masala. And of course, it's particularly interesting that chicken tikka masala was indeed a British invention. The story goes that a bunch of rather drunken British football hooligans landed up after a match in an Indian restaurant, ordered chicken tikka, and when it was served to them, rather belligerently asked the waiter, where's the gravy? Now, these people were very drunk and very large and very muscular and rather numerous, and the waiter decided not to quibble with them. So he took the dish, the chicken tikka, back into the kitchen, opened a can of Campbell's tomato soup, poured it on the dish, sprinkled some extra spices on it, brought it back and announced chicken tikka masala. And thus was a dish born that became incredibly popular and swept England. And so if you get chicken tikka masala in India, you're actually eating a British Indian dish. And that's the sort of miscegenation that took place with the so-called Indian colonization of London. But I think it would be wrong to imply that there was any equality to the exercise. Indians were, of course, colonized in India, came to England, as Arup Chatterjee well depicts, completely mesmerized by the spell that colonialism had cast upon Indian minds. The colonization of the Indian mind is very apparent in some of the extraordinary admiring references to London that you see from Indian visitors and travelers over the centuries. There's one anecdote, Arup, that you don't mention, which I came across in a different book about Ranji's first arrival in England, the great prince and cricketer Ranjit Singh, in which he is startled to discover white people polishing shoes, and asks his English companion how on earth that was possible, and is promptly assured that these white people doing lower caste work were actually Irishmen. And the way in which some of the sort of British English gradations and class hierarchies fitted into some of India's own casteism and classism are perhaps a subtext that might have been explored somewhat farther. There's a very sad story I wanted to mention because I'd never heard it before of a young child kidnapped from Madras in 1720 and brought to England, given as a domestic servant to a rather imperious lady who mistreated him, tried to convert him to Christianity. He refused, made him perform clownish acts for her guests because he was such a curiosity. He was deeply frustrated and unhappy. One day, 4 years later, in 1724, set fire to the sheets, according to the story, of the house, and decamped with 20 guineas. God knows where he thought he would run away to with his color of skin. He stood out like a sore thumb and was promptly arrested and very tragically hanged. Hanged apparently, but not before being converted. He had been named Julian by his mistress and subsequently was renamed John after his conversion and promptly hanged at the Tyburn tree. So not a happy story, but perhaps in some ways more emblematic of the Indian experience in the early days than that of Ranji. And I must say that since I mentioned Ranji, I will have a small complaint for you, Arup Chatterjee, not enough cricket in the book. Because Indians playing cricket in London is actually a major sub-story. You mentioned Ranji, but you don't mention either Dalip Singhji or the Nawab of Pataudi, who became the first Indians to play for England, and who were so, I'm afraid, internalized in the sort of English way that even though India was playing Test cricket by the time of Dalip and Pataudi, they first played for England, because that's what they thought was a more authentic team. And I think it would be quite interesting to have had a little more about that. Perhaps if this book is going to be such a success, there might be an expanded edition. You might well look at adding a few more pages on Indian cricketers and how their cricket affected their image in the UK. What I thought was particularly strong. Oh, by the way, on the question of cricket in the UK, you come down to the 1990s. There was actually a test match against India. It happens. I can't remember. It was a tour of 90 or 95 when 4 people of Indian descent, all Londoners, played for England in a test match against India. That was Min Patel, Ronnie Irani, Nasir Hussain, who was actually born in Madras, and a Guyanese of Indian descent, Mark Ram Prakash. And they were all playing for England against India for cricket. I'm sure there's a story there that you really could expatiate upon, Arup Chatterjee. But what I think is particularly interesting and strong in the book is the description of Indian political figures in England. It's been alluded to already, quite remarkable. Dadabhai Nauroji being the obvious one, but then very much the story of Shapuji Saklatwala. Nauroji, like many of the Indians, Ramesh Chandra Dutt and others in the late 19th century, were Liberal Party supporters. Saklatwala, who was essentially a communist at heart, was elected as a Labour MP, and took a stridently anti-colonial stand, which helped inspire someone like V.K. Krishna Menon, who then, of course, took the India League, of which he became secretary, into a much more radical direction. And Krishna Menon also worked with Alan Lane in the Pelican Press as part of Penguin, and, for example, got Passage to India published there and other books. And Krishna Menon, at the same time, had this curious sort of love-hate relationship with England. He was, as we all know, perhaps the most visible, prominent Indian face in the first half of the 20th century in London. The India League itself was very much his. He was a dominant figure. He was speaking all over the place, highly influential, highly vocal, and ended up then as India's first High Commissioner immediately after independence in London, went on to other positions in the government of India. In 1963, as Arup Chatterjee quotes, he wrote an article in the London Sunday Times, which surprisingly was full of affection for London. And one of his comments was that one does not get lost in London. And that comment struck me as particularly interesting. He was that much at home there. He probably was, in fact, more at home in London than in any Indian city, including New Delhi, which he served in as a minister of the Indian government. And that kind of love-hate thing was almost always there. One of the first, in fact, the first president of the Indian National Congress, W.C. Banerjee, was an eminent lawyer. I think he was the 4th Indian to qualify for the bar in England in the 1870s or 80s. W.C. Banerjee apparently had 2 residences in London and Calcutta and Park Street, which were equally British and equal and pretty much identical and evocative of that. And I think Arup Chatterjee, quite rightly, as has already been mentioned, cleverly refers to the Indian baristocracy of lawyers. It's no accident, for example, that when Muhammad Ali Jinnah found Indian nationalism being taken in a populist direction, as he saw it, by Mahatma Gandhi, his first reaction was to sulk, leave India altogether, but come to London and establish a legal practice which actually thrived and made him an extremely wealthy man. So that was part of the continuing baristocracy. And even today, in post-independence India, there are, of course, large numbers of Indian lawyers who are thriving and flourishing there. I thought that the book was incredibly readable. I take Gopal Gandhi's point about the seeming lack of an overall thrust, simply because there's so many stories that if there is an overarching vision, particularly on issues of the racism, for example, which has been somewhat underplayed, it perhaps gets lost in the number of stories, anecdotes, and detail in the book. But having said that, the book doesn't suffer for it precisely because it's such a delightful read. I'd like to congratulate Arup Chatterjee on having done this, paid to a souffle, as somebody once said about Woodhouse's writing. It's such a finely constructed work that it would be wrong to pick holes in it. But I would love to, once the book has come out and been widely read and no doubt taught in various classrooms, for Arup Chatterjee perhaps to think of a revised, expanded second edition where he might address some of the points that have been made in the remarks today. But once again, congratulations for Indians in London, and wishing you a very, very big success with this book.
Thank you, Shashi. Can we all hold up this book if we have to have a copy? Because it's a launch and our audience on YouTube should see a copy of the book, that it's a book launch. So here we are. There it is. Buy the book, read it, enjoy it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And congratulations once again, Arup. Dr. Tharoor sort of put his finger on the pulse because I teach with you, so I know better that you don't want academics to be just a conversation among specialists. So you are always trying to break into the popular mold to make scholarship accessible. But on the other hand, you are an academic and a very serious scholar. So along with many other comments that very, very enriching comments that Dr. Tharoor made about cricket, about many stories that he told himself, and about barristers and others. He also sort of caught you there in terms of the terrain that you're trying to navigate, which is really a compliment. So Arup, I just have one or two comments, and I would, with those, and you have an array of such rich comments in front of you. The house after that will be yours. I have only one question. That when one goes back 500 years into talking about Indians, then one can do it retroactively, as in who are considered Indians today are considered Indians back then, or one can go into a pre-independence, pre-partition terrain of who was considered Indian when, and then go into even the pre-British terrain of who is considered Indian when. So I want to ask you that, did you go by self-identification, or did you go by identification by others? So who are Indians? That's my question to you. But with that, over to for Arup, Dr. Arup Chatterjee for talking about his own book and for responding to the comments that he has received today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a huge privilege for me to have heard these comments, to have listened to all of you, and it's been a delight talking about this book, listening to your views, and I have a wide array of suggestions and reviews, which I don't think I would have got at the most choicest of periodicals. So there's a lot to ponder there for me. I'd like to, with permission, answer the last question, if I might, because time is precious, and I don't know how much I have. It's quite simply, my note to the reader says that the title Indians in London refers not to the migrants from India to the British capital, which is India after 1947, but it in general refers to people from South Asia who were once Indians. And herein comes the controversial question of what determines Indianhood and what determines the Indian geography. And I suppose this will also allow me to answer a very, very vital and perhaps one of the most vital questions that has been raised on Indians in London, beginning with Professor Gandhi and I think Dr. Tharoor also to some extent chimed in. So while there was no agenda, and while I really don't have ideologies, I understand it is very difficult to believe in the 21st century, how can one not have agendas and ideologies? I think there is a very clear thesis statement, which I did arrive at after finishing my researches, and that was that London has been quite arbitrarily westernized, or it's been imagined as a Western capital or an imperial center. And this imagination requires a great deal of challenging, and there are highly insufficient grounds to determine London already as a Western city, even in the 21st century, let alone in the 1450s or 1550s when the book actually begins. So Indians in London is an imaginative reorientation of the emotional and cultural geography of London. So in the beginning of the book, I have given a map which shows about 200 characters. I call them characters or protagonists in my book, but these are people who lived real lives in history, as it were. And these 200 characters and all the settlements and the restaurants and the universities they went to, and the universities they blew up or tried to blow up, were indeed a settlement. And it's only a sample. I mean, 200 comes nowhere close to the number of Laskars and Ayahs and delegates and students there were in London in the 19th century. So I call this imaginative, emotional and cultural geography as Londonistan. And this book did have an agenda, that is to map the Londonistan, but to map it very, as I think Professor Paul Flather pointed, in a very, I suppose, vulnerable way, because I've been on the stories that I grew up since childhood, and these were Indian stories going back to scriptures, which go back several thousands of years, where the stories don't tend to take sides. And perhaps a little bit of that vulnerability was imbibed unconsciously in my persona, and that persona, when it walks through London as an Indian citizen, is challenged or is invited and sometimes seduced and sometimes irritated by the clamors of the tourist guides, and the kind of disturbance and seduction and joy and delight and thrill and perhaps even a bit of trauma that one feels as a visitor in London was very captivating for me. It has been the number of times I've visited there. I haven't been there a lot of the times that my colleagues might have been. But since childhood, I think it is not very surprising for Indians to imagine London in an emotional way. And I think this is demonstrated very evocatively in a novel by Amitav Ghosh called Shadow Lines, where Thridi, one of the central characters, teaches his nephew not to imagine any other Indian city, for example, Calcutta, where they live, or New Delhi would have been one of the primary choices. But he teaches his nephew, the protagonist, the narrator, to imagine London. And I think it might come across as a sign of the colonial hangover or the yet to be decolonized sensibility in the Indian literary mind. But actually, it's quite the contrary. It is, in fact, a very active decolonization of London, beginning from one's own home, one's own mind. And one needs to go out of the mind, as somebody once said. It was Alan Watts, I think, in order to understand it. So in a culture where we are so close to activities like consciousness studies, meditative practices, I think it is not difficult for us to understand that we have to perhaps have an external look at ourselves in order to understand ourselves better, in order to recognize what we are capable of. So this was, with all due respect, and I very, very humbly take the criticism, and in fact, it is a criticism which I thought I was very consciously introducing. It was a flaw, I'm sorry, which I thought I was very, very consciously introducing into the 5-act structure of the book. So it was intended as a creative enterprise. It was intended as a storytelling and a literary enterprise. However, because I'm also a student of what I call epistemic humility or epistemological humility, I'm always very happy to break and disrupt and challenge my own beliefs and move forward. And almost in every act, I found that I was breaking certain preconceived notions that I had since school, or that were sort of shoved down my throat by this or that ideology. And so the anecdotes, or as one of my professors has recently called the trivia, that appears in the book, is actually more of a Triveni Sangam, or a confluence of various streams and tributaries, as Professor Flather has also pointed out. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And while I take the criticism with bowed head, I do appreciate the kind of generosity that Dr. Tharoor and Professor Gandhi and Professor Flather have given to this book. And that brings me to the comments of Professor Michael Fisher. I think it would be very, very unjust of me not to expressly, very, very explicitly recognize today that Professor Michael Fisher's book has been one of the biggest inspirations, not to mention also the speech of one of the discussants I heard from Oxford Union. I think that was 3 or 4 years ago. And that speech also stirred me into writing something about the Indian and British relationship over the last 300 or 400 years. But Professor Michael Fisher's work, Counterflows to Colonialism, also fueled my imagination, as did Professor Rosina Visram's book, Asians in Britain, which was written just a tiny little bit before Professor Fisher's book. So I think these two scholars, and I'm deeply privileged to have one of them today as a discussant, did fuel my imagination very, very much. And I think I do stand to gain a lot from the reviews, the comments that have come in. I would sincerely request my publishers to pay special heed to Professor Gopal Gandhi's comments, because the towering generosity that he has shown to the fate of the pictures, I think needs to be taken very, very seriously. And I thank JGU from the bottom of my heart, because JGU is perhaps one of the only places, and I say perhaps one of the only, not as a solecism, but I think it is the only place where this kind of a reimagination of London could have taken place, or at least I could have reimagined London in this way, because in this university I have learned that reincarnation does not have to wait for a lifetime. One can be reborn almost every day, and one can revive oneself almost every day, as our Vice Chancellor and our professors, our deans do it on a day-to-day basis. It's a very, very deeply inspiring place. I'm very proud to be in this university. I'm also very proud that I was born in India, and I'm very grateful to the two people who gave me birth, my parents, Ashit and Vishakha. I think they couldn't have chosen a better country, because it's a privilege to be born in India. And I don't suppose I could have written a book called Indians in London Elsewhere in the World. So I thank them for that. And I thank Professor Albeena for her comments. Very, very insightful and very generous comments, and my publishers. And thank you all for your wonderful insights. So that I suppose I might close with that, if that's all right.
Yes, thank you so much, Arup, and heartiest congratulations once again. I'm using my prerogative as the moderator to once again re-invite Professor Gopal Gandhi, who wants to just make some additional quick comments. So, Professor Gandhi.
I just want to say once again what a joy it has been to read Arup Babu's book. For one reason which I forgot to mention, which is that my association with West Bengal being so strong and so cherished by me, I could not but celebrate the strong presence of Bengal among the Indians in London. And starting W.C. Banerjee, whom Shashi mentioned, and then Ramohan Roy, Tagore, Vivekananda, Subhash Bose, Aurobindo Ghosh, I could not but celebrate the presence of these extraordinary makers of India in the book as Indians in London. And it reminded me of one amazingly humorous and amazingly loving statement made by Gandhi, who said that Bengal is convinced that India is an integral part of Bengal.
Albeena, Smita Tharoor, who is herself a very distinguished scholar and practitioner, she has just reminded us that we should hold the book and take a screenshot to capture this moment. So although I don't have a copy of the book, somebody should take a screenshot while we do this, which will capture the moment.
That's fine.
I have a copy of the book on me.
Is the photo taken? Thank you.
Thank you. Arup, over to you before we go to Professor Sridhar.
Yeah, I, in my very, very nervous excitement and diffidence, I forgot to add a couple of nuggets. I especially for the very, very interesting remark that Dr. Tharoor made that on cricket. In fact, when I began conceiving this book, it was conceived as a snapshot moment of Kapil Dev lifting the 1983 World Cup. And what is going to happen after I've finished with all the toil that this book will now take me through in terms of reaching out to readers and reviewers and receiving comments and reworking, is a sequel to this book, which is called Londonistan, as I think I did mention. And this tells the story after 1947. So where I thought cricket would in all likelihood have a more prominent role to play than it did before 1947. So that is to you, Dr. Tharoor, and I very much appreciate the comment you made. And since a lot of people have invoked Veeraswamy, and I think Dr. Tharoor also invoked the India Club, I just wanted to add that I began writing this book in India Club, and the spirit of Indian food or London food does have its imprint. It has its specters in the book, as it were. So which is why it begins with food and also ends with food. So when I started writing the book at the India Club, it was already it was already in the throes of some sort of urban problem, and I'm very, very glad that it seems to have recovered from that. And I thank the Londoners for having brought for the India Club out of its troubles, and I'm very grateful to London as well, the city that I didn't mention. So thank you, Albeena. Thank you for those.
Yes, thank you, Arup. Now over back to Professor Sudarshan, who will continue.
Well, I really don't have very much to say, except that I'm so grateful that this has been such a fascinating session. When we plan these events, we can't anticipate just how gripping and interesting it would be. And I'm and it's one of the features of our university, that we must celebrate the achievements of our colleagues. I mean, celebrating other people, is something that in my book is a virtue. You may not, yourself have accomplished very much, but when somebody does something very marvelous, I think one should spare the time and make the effort to celebrate it. And that's been my relationship with Arup. He's in the law school, I'm in the public policy school, but whenever he writes something, such as his book on the railways or this wonderful book, I feel compelled to call upon others and join in a pure celebration of an accomplishment. So that's all I wanted to say, but our registrar will end the session. Thank you.
So welcome to Professor Sridhar D. Patnaik. It's a pleasure to have him making the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Albeena, and thanks to Professor Sudarshan as well. Well, first of all, I take this opportunity to congratulate Arup Chatterjee for the excellent work entitled Indians in London, from the birth of the East India Company to independent India. It's a work transcending many areas, capturing the story of human life as it unfolded during the vast space of 500 years. I had the opportunity to read excerpts from the book as shared by Arup. And as a work transcending boundaries, I must say the project displays a strong compatibility with the ethos and philosophy of the O.P. Jindal Global University. As an institution of eminence and a world-class university, we are committed to high-quality interdisciplinary research in a vibrant and plural environment facilitated by supportive governance and enabling policies to allow faculty members pursue individual research. And it is indeed heartening to note that the current work is an outcome of such policies at the O.P. Jindal Global University. I once again congratulate Arup for this fascinating work, which I'm sure could become a very good case study for those who are pursuing methods of conducting research using historical and archival spaces to conduct their research activities. And I hope that Arup will continue to enthrall us with his rich writings. We are also most grateful to our esteemed panelists, Professor Gopalkrishna Gandhi, Professor Paul Flather, Professor Michael Fisher, and Dr. Shashi Tharoor for their seminal reflections while disentangling complex ideas and making the imperceptible perceptible. Hearing them this evening is fascinating, and I completely agree with Albeena that it's a sheer delight to specialists and generalists alike. And that's a kind of a work that Arup had produced. And I take this opportunity that we are so very much honored by their presence. And on behalf of the university, I would like to thank each one of them for their precious time and indispensable support to the university over the years. I'm also grateful to the Vice Chancellor for his unwavering support and singular commitment to the vision and mission of the university. I also thank Professor Sudarshan for curating this wonderful program and leading all of us to join this enchanting book launch and discussion. I sincerely thank my colleagues at the Office of Information Technology, Media and Communication, and staff members of the School of Government and Public Policy and the Office of the Vice Chancellor for their untiring and enthusiastic support, as always, in organizing the program. I end my note by thanking each and everyone once again and congratulating Arup for this wonderful work. Thank you all.
So I just wanted to add, and I think this book and this book launch and a lot of things that I'm going to be writing in future, in all likelihood would not have been possible without JGU, without Professor Raj Kumar here, and Professor Sudarshan's support has been towering and as comforting as a banyan tree for this book and throughout the preparations for the book launch. I'm deeply grateful to the university, the deans, and Professor Sridhar, who on such a short notice managed to read so much of the book and shared his very deep insights on the book. Thank you very much. And I'm very, very grateful to you. Pranam.
Thank you.